This presentation is for a class at the University of Utah called Cross-Cultural Communications, Linguistics 3600. My name is Karen. We're going to be looking today at cultural values. This is a chapter that comes out of our textbook and how they are guidelines for behavior. The first thing we're going to talk about is perception. We've already spent quite a bit of time in this class talking about how we come to the perceptions that we have. Think back to the activity we did where we looked at 5 different pictures, and then we talked about how our experiences shaped the things that we saw in those pictures. Okay, the definition from the textbook, or some information about perception, says by exposing a large collection of people to similar experiences, culture generates similar meanings and similar behaviors. There are 5 things that the textbook identifies as being key to developing our cultural values. The first thing is selectivity. So culture is selective. It focuses on selected information and then it filters out the rest. So it helps us to narrow our focus onto one thing, but doesn't allow us to see the whole picture. That means that people from other cultures may see things differently, even the same thing. Okay? The second thing is that culture is learned. Experiences that we have in our lives help us to see the world a certain way. We've already talked about how stereotypes are formed in this way, that because we have an experience with a person or a small group of individuals, that we then generalize those experiences to the whole group. Okay, so that's one way that it's learned. Our parents also help us learn sort of which direction we're going. The third thing is that it's culturally determined. Okay, the culture that we're born into helps teach us the meaning of something that we see, signs or any sort of thing that we interact with in the world. Think about religion. Religion's kind of the first thing that comes to mind there. So if someone is wearing a piece of jewelry with a cross, their culture has taught them specific meaning about what that means, where to someone else that might be meaningless because their culture doesn't participate in using a cross to have specific meaning. The fourth thing is that culture is consistent. The book says that interpretations do not usually change. I want you to keep this in mind because we're also going to talk about how things do change constantly. So the book even contradicts itself in this chapter a little bit. Okay, the fifth thing is that often our perception is inaccurate. It's subjective, so we see only what we want to see. In fact, when we have evidence that proves our perception to be wrong, we often ignore that evidence in favor of evidence that supports it to be correct. Okay, there's a good rule of thumb for interacting with people and their cultures. If you consider the other person strange, then they probably consider you strange. Cultural patterns exist and help us to evaluate information about different cultures. So when we are talking about the dominant cultural values of a culture, we're really looking at patterns. So these are some things that we need to keep in mind as we're examining these patterns. The first one is that cultural patterns encompass the conditions that contribute to a social group's perception of the world and how they live in that world. Okay. The second thing is that people carry their culture wherever they go. Remember the story of the young man and the glasses, right? He was given a certain color of glasses from the minute he was born, and so that shaped the way that he saw the world, and he was unable to take off those cultural glasses even when he got to a new culture. The third thing is that examining one's own values can reveal information that is often overlooked or taken for granted. One thing that I really like about our textbook is that it asks a lot of reflective questions so that we can evaluate what our own cultural beliefs are. And the fourth thing is that personal cultural values can serve as an important reference point for making comparisons with cultures. We've talked a lot about how it's necessary to know yourself and your culture before you get to know someone else's. That it's easier when you know your culture to understand where the differences or similarities might be. Okay. However, our book warns us that we should be aware of these things. I like that the list for cultural patterns is short, but the list of things that we have to be cautious of is quite a bit longer. Okay, so when we are looking at cultural patterns, these are some things we need to keep in mind so that we don't make wrong judgments or false judgments. The first one is that the value of a culture is not necessarily reflective of all individuals. Okay? So all individuals may not share the same cultural value. Okay, we've already talked about that a little bit as well. Remember our bell curve and how some individuals are outliers in that culture. The second thing is that visual response to patterns on a continuum, not one or the other. So we've talked quite a bit about like two different what seem like opposites. So something like individualism and collectivism. And I've encouraged you to see those on a continuum so that one person is not either purely individualistic or collectivist. It's that people sort of range somewhere on that continuum and possess a little bit of both things. Okay, patterns do not operate in isolation. So as we're examining one cultural value, they often interact with other values of the culture, other things with the culture. Typical cultural patterns must be limited to values of the dominant culture of the country. So we've already discussed quite a bit about what dominant culture means. Then, this one is actually one of my favorites. There are literally hundreds of patterns per country. So that means that even though we say something is a dominant cultural value, there really are several patterns that we're looking at, and they may or may not be reflective of all of the individuals in the country. Okay, the last two, cultures change and so do values. So here we get a little bit of a contradiction in our textbook where it talks about how cultures change over time and so do values. But we said earlier that perceptions are really difficult to change. And that's true. It is really difficult once you've formed some sort of an opinion or a specific perception to change that perception to something new. However, over time and generation to generation, cultural values do change. Okay? We know this because we don't still dress the same way that we did in the United States in the 1800s. So if things didn't change, we would still value that same notion of modesty and dresses. Women would always be wearing dresses. We wouldn't wear pants to school. Okay, so we can see that those things have changed over time, and with it changes the perceptions of those values. Okay, and then the last one, all cultures have examples of contradictory values. I think that's one reason why it's valuable to view this on a continuum, is because not all people are going to be one thing or the other. They often have some evidence of both extremes or both ends of the continuum in their behavior. And so for one thing, they might be on one end, like let's look at honesty. So I might believe that I should always tell the truth, except when my wife asks me, does this dress make me look fat? And then in that case, I need to lie to make sure that our relationship's preserved. So in this case, we have a couple of different patterns that are interacting together. We have the value of honesty with the value of our relationship and sort of interpersonal relationships. And so in some cases, one might be higher than the other to make sure that I preserve the relationship if that's the most important thing. But other than that, honesty is probably the highest, or pretty high for most people. So these values can interact, and we see examples of contradictions. We've already discussed several contradictions in dominant cultures around the world. We'll look at a couple more of those today. Okay, here are some examples of dominant American cultural values. So we're looking at U.S. American values. Okay, the first one that the book lists, let me just take a moment to say that this chapter in the book is really, really difficult to understand. It's pretty intense to learn the different scales and things by which people judge cultures or decide what the value rankings are. For our purposes, that information, the different scales, is not as important to us as looking at what the values are. So think about, as you're reading through the chapter, the different values that are listed, and try to decide where you fall on the continuum. That's the part that's going to be most important for our purposes. Okay, so as we look at some U.S. American dominant values, the first one is personal control over the environment. we see this in places like the desert, like Las Vegas, Southern California, where we bring in water or form dams to have big cities have their water supply. So instead of going to where the water supply is and building our cities there, we build our cities somewhere we want to, and then we bring in the resources that we need. Okay, we also use expressions, or used to use expressions like, I'm going to tame the wild frontier. So we have this notion that we are the individuals are the people who are going to make sure that they are in control over the environment. And that's different from other cultures. Okay, the second one that the book identifies is change. In the United States, progress is really good. In fact, we use words like new and improved in marketing quite a bit. And there's some, I'm not into marketing, but there's some amount of time that if a person is buying a product and they don't see the words new and improved for some reason or other, then it doesn't sell as well. So companies are constantly trying to change the way that they market their products so that they can label it as new and improved to help the consumer want to purchase it. The third one is time and its control. It's pretty clear in U.S. American culture that we manage our lives according to our schedules and deadlines. In fact, we often talk about time as if it's a commodity, like money. So we talk about being able to save time, or how are you going to spend your time, as if there's some sort of bank where all of our saved time builds up, and then we can use it again. The fourth one is equality or egalitarianism. So we have talked several times in this class about the contradictions in this particular value. So we have this idea that everyone in the United States has an equal opportunity. Everyone can become whatever they want to become. And we see this again in informality of social relationships. So we often use our first names. It's okay for someone of one socioeconomic class to date someone of another socioeconomic class. It's not unheard of for an employee to go and visit with the boss in their office. That's perfectly allowed. Okay. But we've also talked about the contradictions and how what we say we believe in those things is not always what is done in practice. The last one on this slide, is about individuality and privacy. So we've talked a lot about how the U.S. is an individualist culture. We value things like initiative and self-reliance. So we want to make sure our kids, as they grow up, are going to be able to handle things on their own, but then there's a certain point, usually around age 18, where we kind of kick them out of the house and make them survive on their own. Where in a collectivist environment or culture, we would see the family stay together for quite a bit longer, and they even would continue to economically help one another. Okay, I have just a few more for the U.S. American values. Competition and free enterprise. So one way that we see this come out is that we constantly have a number of top 10 lists. So it's really important for us to be the best at something. So we might go to the internet to say, oh, I want to go to a movie. Let's see how the movies are rated. And we're constantly looking for what things are the best. Okay, and we're working hard to get to be the best. We believe that competition breeds improvements and all of those other good things that we value here. The second one on this slide is about being future-oriented. Okay, we talked only briefly about how we orient in terms of time. So in time orientation, we could be past-oriented, future-oriented, or present-oriented. Okay? Future-oriented means that what lies ahead is more important than what has happened before. So we often in the United States are talking about what it is that we're going to do. So we ask little children from the time they're very small, we ask them what they're going to be when they grow up. Always a focus of what it is that's going to happen in the future. If you're past oriented, then you would see a lot of references to ancestors and seeing how things in the past have influenced the way things are today. We also see a lot of longing for the way things used to be. Okay, one of the problems that can happen with with time orientation is that when you are differently oriented than another culture, we often view that other culture negatively. So again, this is about perception and how our perceptions influence the things that we see. So in a present-oriented culture, where it's the most important for you to live in the present and live in the moment, we see that present-oriented cultures believe that future-oriented cultures are a slave to their future. They're always working too hard. They never take time to enjoy what's going on around them. Okay, the reverse, future-oriented cultures see present-oriented cultures as very selfish, that they spend a lot of time on themselves and that they aren't working hard to better themselves. And so we see future-oriented cultures, we, U.S. American, future-oriented cultures see present-oriented cultures as kind of lazy, selfish, things like that. We see past-oriented cultures as too tied to tradition. We think, oh, they just won't pick up with the new things that are coming in. They're always worried about what's gone on before, and they're not willing to try something new. So we can have a lot of conflicts about values and beliefs in the time orientation piece. The United States is very action or work oriented. We place value on hard work, and we like people to be doing things. Okay, I'm going to talk about that one a little bit more in just a minute. Directness, we often encourage people to get right to the point. There are some times when we're indirect, but we expect in general that people are very direct. So if a boss asks you to complete a task, you would tell the boss whether or not you could complete the task and whether or not you had the tools available to complete it. In other cultures where people are indirect, they might say yes to the boss that they could complete it even if they don't have all of the tools to complete it, because it's more important to answer the boss appropriately than it is to be direct and get the information across that you need. Okay, the last one here is materialism. So in the United States, it's really important for us to have things. So we work pretty hard to get a house. We talk often about what kind of car we have. It might be important for people to have the latest technology. We're very concerned about comfort, right? We want air conditioning. We are looking forward to times when we can be more comfortable. So we're constantly changing the environment around us and acquiring things to improve our lives. We also tend, because of materialism and the future orientation, we tend to not be as happy with what we have right now. So we might think things like, well, I'll be happy when I have, and whatever that thing is. So I'll be happier once I have my new car. Instead of thinking, wow, I have this great car, I'm so grateful to be there. So again, people who are from a differently oriented culture may have some conflicts as these values come into play. Okay. For our discussion questions tonight, I asked you some questions about how you are oriented. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about activity orientation and give you some examples from my personal life. So I am a U.S. American, so I come from that culture. I'm very activity oriented. Our book talks about a doing culture versus a being culture. Okay, I am from a doing culture. In fact, I'm so much from a doing culture that I make to-do lists of all the things that I have to do. And I only feel good when I start to cross off those things. If I can't cross off those things, sometimes I even make my list with smaller tasks so that I have things that I cross off. Because at the end of the day, I feel good to know that I have done something, and I have to be able to show that. So this can cause some problems in terms of making sure that yourself is taken care of. Okay, because that's not a true activity-oriented person, way down on the continuum close to activity, is not always living a very healthy life. So people will say to me like, oh, you should just relax and take a bath. I have this beautiful bathtub and I love to be in my bathtub, but I feel guilty. When I get in my bathtub, I feel like I'm not doing something. So I have started to write on my list, okay, take bath, 30 minutes, play with children. So I've tried to now put things on my list so that I feel like I'm doing them, even though they might be more of a being type activity. So another example of where we see this is think about things that your parents said to you when you were younger. So if I were sitting around at my home reading, watching TV, taking a nap, my parents would say something like, you know, why don't you go do something? Or, you know, you're always just sitting around doing nothing. Now, if you're from a being culture, there is no sitting around doing nothing. If you're meditating or other things, you are doing. It's just a very different type of belief of what doing and being looks like. Okay, so in being cultures, being is doing something, where in activity cultures, being is not considered doing something. Okay, so just something for you to think about. In your discussion questions, you'll write about where you're oriented, but I wanted to give you an example. Okay. The other thing that our textbook talks about in this chapter, kind of interesting placement here, and we've already talked about this a little bit with nonverbal communication, so I want to just review it once more where it's listed in our chapter. And that's about the difference between a high context culture and a low context culture. So a low context culture, like the United States and English, a low context culture is one where all of the meaning that you need is carried in the words. So it's not necessary for me to use gestures or outside things to help you understand what's going on. You could have your eyes closed and understand most of what was being said. So in a low context culture, everything you need to know is in the words. In a high context culture, that's not true. In a high context culture, the meaning is much more than just the words that you hear. You have to pay very close attention to inference and things that we're talking about, to gestures, to silence, and to other subtle messages. So Japanese is often referred to as a really good example of a high context culture. But it's important when you're having a conversation in a high context culture to understand the other factors that are going on around you. Okay, so think about this question at the bottom. Think about what incidents can occur when we're communicating across these two patterns. So if I'm from a low context culture and someone is speaking to me who is from a high context culture, it's likely that I am not getting all of the meaning. I may recognize this. I may think, boy, why are they not telling me everything I need to know? Or I may not understand that the information they were giving me is not full without the other outside the nonverbal cues that they're giving me. So sometimes I might understand that and sometimes I might not. The reverse is that if you're from a high context culture and you're listening to someone who is from a low context culture, you might be trying to interpret meaning in things that don't mean anything. So if while I'm speaking I'm also scratching my head, you might think that that has some sort of meaning that it does not in fact carry. Okay, so as we talk about these cultural values, keep in mind the things that you personally are feeling and the differences among the cultures that you've been a part of.